The Army That Wore Belts. Part 1. The Meeting in Van Nuys. The meeting was in a conference room above a sporting goods store in Van Nuys, which was not where history was supposed to happen but often did. Chuck Norris had driven north from Torrance on a Wednesday evening in March of 1974, arriving 20 minutes early out of the habit of a man who had learned that being the first person in a room gave you the advantage of choosing where you sat. The conference room had 6 chairs around a folding table, a water pitcher and paper cups. He chose the chair facing the door and poured himself water and waited. The others arrived in the next 15 minutes, 5 men, all of whom he knew from the tournament circuit, experienced practitioners and instructors, each running his own operation in a different part of Southern California, each carrying a specific reputation in the community and a specific set of concerns about the state of American martial arts in 1974 that had generated, through a series of informal conversations and one formally convened meeting the previous autumn, the invitation to this room. The problem, as they had been discussing it across various forums for the better part of 2 years, was structural. American martial arts in 1974 existed as a collection of fiefdoms, individual schools and instructors, each operating under their own standards, their own ranking systems, their own conception of what a black belt meant and what it required. There was no governing body. There was no standardization of rank or curriculum. There was no organization that could speak for the discipline as a whole, that could establish minimum standards for instruction, that could protect students from schools that were franchising black belts in 6 months for the right fee. This was not a small problem. The martial arts boom of the early 1970s, accelerated by Bruce Lee's films, by the cultural moment, by the specific American appetite for disciplines that combined physical competence with philosophical depth, had produced a proliferation of schools of wildly uneven quality. For every school run by a genuine practitioner with serious training behind them, there were 3 run by people whose primary qualification was a commercially acquired certificate and an entrepreneurial instinct. The consumers of this market, the students, had no way to evaluate what they were purchasing. Chuck had been thinking about this for 3 years, not theoretically, practically, as a person who had built something real and who watched it being diluted by proximity to things that were not real. He looked at the 5 men around the table. He said, "I want to build an organization, not a trade association, not a networking group, an actual organization with actual standards and an actual system for enforcing them. A federation." The 5 men looked at each other and then at Chuck. One of them, a compact, precise man named Martin Cho, who ran a school in Glendale and who had the specific quality of someone who evaluates proposals rather than receives them, said, "Define what you mean by standards." "Standards for rank," Chuck said. "Minimum requirements for the black belt, which every school in the Federation would have to meet. Standards for instructor certification. You can't teach what you don't know, and the Federation would verify that you know it. And standards for ethical practice, fee structures, student agreements, the things that prevent the exploitation of students who don't understand what they're signing up for. And the enforcement mechanism," Cho said. "Membership in the Federation is voluntary," Chuck said. "No one is compelled to join. But the Federation's standards, if we set them correctly, become the industry standard by weight of membership. If the majority of serious schools are members, the schools that aren't members start to have a credibility problem." Another man, Dave Richter, who ran 2 schools in the San Fernando Valley and who was known in the community for a forthright manner that occasionally irritated people and always respected, said, "Who governs the Federation?" "The members," Chuck said. "A board elected from the membership. I would chair it initially because someone has to build the thing, but the governance structure would be designed so that the chair doesn't control it. The membership controls it." "And your position within the Federation," Richter said. "Your schools, your students, your name?" The federation would be built partly on your reputation. That creates a power dynamic. I know, Chuck said. I've thought about it. My answer is full transparency about the finances, term limits for the chair, and an independent committee for standards development that I'm not on. He paused. The federation only works if it's genuinely independent. A federation that's dependent on one person's reputation isn't a federation, it's a brand extension. The meeting went on for 2 hours. By the end, they had agreed on the broad structure of what would become the United Fighting Arts Federation, the UFAF, and had assigned initial working groups to develop the standards, the governance documents, and the membership criteria. Chuck drove back to Torrance in the dark, aware that he had just committed himself to something that was going to be significantly harder than fighting anyone he had ever fought. Part 2. The building year. Building the Federation turned out to require a skill set that was adjacent to but distinct from the skills he had developed as a competitor and teacher. Competition required the discipline of the isolated individual, the training, the preparation, the performance at the critical moment, all of which happened inside a container of personal will. Teaching required a specific form of attention and communication that he had developed over a decade of practice. Building an organization required both of these plus something else, the ability to hold a shared vision consistently enough and communicate it convincingly enough that other people with their own agendas and their own expertise and their own complicated relationships to the community would voluntarily subordinate those agendas to the shared project. He was 34 years old, and he had never managed anyone in the organizational sense of the term. He had run his schools, which involved managing relationships with instructors and students. He had competed, which involved managing himself. He had won championships, which involved managing the specific conditions of the match environment. None of these were useless preparation for building an organization, but none of them were sufficient preparation either. He learned by doing, which was his habitual method and which was the right method for this situation, because there was no other available method. The Federation's early months were a sustained exercise in problem solving for problems he had not anticipated. The precise language of the standards documents, which turned out to matter enormously because vague language produced inconsistent application, and inconsistent application undermined the whole point. The political dynamics within the founding group, which were more complex than the initial meeting had suggested, the practical question of how a voluntary federation generated enough revenue to sustain its administrative functions without becoming dependent on any single member's subsidy. He brought Ray Medina into the administrative structure, which helped. Ray had the specific quality of someone who understood both the technical side and the organizational side, and who could translate between the two in the way that productive organizations require. He brought in 2 additional founding members in the summer of 1974 who had organizational experience from outside martial arts, one from a sports federation, one from a professional association, whose different perspective on how organizations worked was both valuable and occasionally frustrating. By the end of 1974, the UFF had 47 member schools, a board of 9, a preliminary standards document, and a membership fee structure that covered the basic administrative costs without surplus. It was not what he had described in the Van Nuys conference room. It was the beginning of what he had described, which was the appropriate condition of a beginning. He taught the 5 o'clock session the following morning with the specific quality of someone who has been managing problems all day and finds in the floor and the work a form of return to the essential. Part 3. The partner. His name was Gerald Walsh, and he had arrived at the Federation in the summer of 1975 as a representative of a group of Texas-based schools that were considering membership. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with the manner of a man who had spent his career in rooms where decisions were made and who understood the choreography of those rooms, when to speak, when to listen, when to move the agenda. He had studied Tang Soo Do for 15 years and run schools in Dallas and Houston for a decade. He was legitimate in his practice and his credentials, which Chuck confirmed through the normal channels of the community. He was also exactly the kind of person the Federation needed at this stage, someone with significant networks in a part of the country that was underrepresented, with the administrative experience to take on a formal role in the governance structure, with the resources to invest in the Federation's growth. Walsh joined the board in September 1975. By January 1976, he was vice chair. By June 1976, he was the operational lead for the Federation's expansion east of the Mississippi, which was the Federation's primary growth challenge and which Walsh had proposed, with persuasive specificity, a plan to address. Chuck trusted him. Not naively, he had been in business relationships that required ongoing assessment and had developed a calibrated approach to professional trust. But the assessment, over 18 months, had returned consistent results. Walsh was competent, his work was good, his relationships within the community were productive, and his judgment on the specific questions that required his judgment had been sound. He did not see the problem building, which was itself a lesson he did not want to learn but learned. Part 4. The meeting he did not know about. It came out the way these things come out, sideways, through a connection he had not expected. A school owner in Nashville, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had joined the Federation in 1976 and whose school was one of the stronger members in the Southeast, called the Federation's administrative office in February 1977 and asked to speak to Chuck directly. He called her back the same day. She told him, in the careful language of someone who is uncertain how the information is going to land, that she had attended a meeting in Atlanta 3 weeks earlier, a meeting of Southeast Region UFAF members, ostensibly convened by Walsh to discuss regional growth strategy, at which Walsh had proposed something that was not in any agenda she had received in advance and that had not been reported to the board. The proposal was a restructuring. Walsh had argued that the Federation's centralized governance model was an impediment to regional growth, that the board's oversight requirements created delays and friction that prevented the Federation from responding to regional opportunities with sufficient speed. He had proposed to a room of approximately 30 regional member schools, a new structure in which regional chapters would have significantly expanded autonomy, including authority over member standards and fee structures, with only a loose affiliation to the national organization. He had studied Tang Soo Do for 15 years and run schools in Dallas and Houston for a decade. He was legitimate in his practice and his credentials, which Chuck confirmed through the normal channels of the community. He was also exactly the kind of person the Federation needed at this stage, someone with significant networks in a part of the country that was underrepresented, with the administrative experience to take on a formal role in the governance structure, with the resources to invest in the Federation's growth. Walsh joined the board in September 1975. By January 1976, he was vice chair. By June 1976, he was the operational lead for the Federation's expansion east of the Mississippi, which was the Federation's primary growth challenge and which Walsh had proposed with persuasive specificity a plan to address. Chuck trusted him. Not naively, he had been in business relationships that required ongoing assessment and had developed a calibrated approach to professional trust. But the assessment over 18 months had returned consistent results. Walsh was competent, his work was good, his relationships within the community were productive, and his judgment on the specific questions that required his judgment had been sound. He did not see the problem building, which was itself a lesson he did not want to learn but learned. Part 4. The meeting he did not know about. It came out the way these things come out, sideways, through a connection he had not expected. A school owner in Nashville, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had joined the Federation in 1976 and whose school was one of the stronger members in the Southeast, called the Federation's administrative office in February 1977 and asked to speak to Chuck directly. He called her back the same day. She told him in the careful language of someone who is uncertain how the information is going to land that she had attended a meeting in Atlanta 3 weeks earlier, a meeting of Southeast Region UFAF members, ostensibly convened by Walsh to discuss regional growth strategy, at which Walsh had proposed something that was not in any agenda she had received in advance and that had not been reported to the board. The proposal was a restructuring. Walsh had argued that the Federation's centralized governance model was an impediment to regional growth, that the board's oversight requirements created delays and friction that prevented the Federation from responding to regional opportunities with sufficient speed. He had proposed to a room of approximately 30 regional member schools, a new structure in which regional chapters would have significantly expanded autonomy, including authority over member standards and fee structures, with only a loose affiliation to the national organization. With 30 member schools, Chuck said, without informing the board or me. I didn't think it was board level until I understood whether there was appetite for it, Walsh said. His voice had the quality of someone managing a situation rather than responding to one. Still controlled, still operating in the mode of someone who is processing options rather than emotions. That's backwards, Chuck said. The board is where you bring ideas before you take them to the members. The members are governed by the board. If you want to change the governance structure, you bring the proposal to the board. He paused. You know that. You've been on the board for 18 months. The board has been slow, Walsh said. The board has been deliberate, Chuck said. Slow and deliberate are different things. Chuck, here's what I want to know, Chuck said. Not what the proposal says, what you actually want. Because the proposal, as Patricia Hale described it, produces a structure in which the regional chapters have autonomous authority over standards and membership, which means the Federation's standards, the whole reason the Federation exists, get fragmented. Each region sets its own standards. The national organization becomes a coordination body with no enforcement capacity. Silence on the line. What that produces, Chuck said, is not a federation. It produces the same fragmentation we built the Federation to address. The same 50 different definitions of what a black belt means, just with a branding umbrella over them. He paused. Is that what you want to build? Because if it is, I'd like to understand why. Walsh was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, with a quality that was not quite honesty but was closer to it than what had preceded it. The current structure puts too much authority in the center. I think the Federation would be healthier with distributed leadership. You mean distributed from me, Chuck said. Not only from you, from the board. Then bring the proposal to the board, Chuck said, formally, with the full governance implications laid out. Let the board debate it and vote on it. If the membership wants to change the governance structure, that's their right through the proper process. He paused. But doing it the way you've been doing it, building a coalition outside the governance structure, presenting the members with a fait accompli, that's not distributed leadership, that's a faction. Part 6. The Resolution and the Aftermath. Walsh brought the proposal to the board in March 1977. Formally with the full documentation, as Chuck had asked, the board debated it over 2 sessions. The debate was substantive. Walsh had identified real tensions in the Federation structure, and some of his concerns about centralization were legitimate, and several board members agreed with portions of his analysis, if not his method. The debate produced a modified governance proposal that addressed some of the concerns, clearer regional autonomy on implementation questions while maintaining centralized standards, that passed with 7 of 9 votes. Walsh voted against the modified proposal. He resigned from the board in April 1977 and withdrew his Texas schools from Federation membership in May. He took 11 of the 30 Southeast schools that had attended the Atlanta meeting with him. He founded a separate organization, the American Martial Arts Alliance, which he launched in June 1977 with himself as president and a governance structure that gave regional chapters the autonomy he had wanted. The UFAF lost 19 member schools in the 6 months between the Atlanta meeting and Walsh's departure. It lost the momentum it had been building in the Southeast. It lost 18 months of organizational development that had to be rebuilt. It did not collapse. Chuck drove to Torrance the morning after Walsh's departure announcement and taught the 5:30 session and the 8 o'clock session and the 10 o'clock session. He ran his forms at 5 in the morning and sat at his desk during the break between the 8 and the 10 and thought about what the loss of the Southeast schools meant for the Federation's growth plans and what the adjusted timeline required. He thought about what he had known and what he had missed. Walsh had been in the Federation for 18 months before the Atlanta meeting. The signs of what he was doing had been detectable 2 months before Patricia Hale called. Ray had been hearing things. Chuck had not been hearing things, which meant he had not been listening in the right places. He wrote this down in the administrative notebook he kept for the Federation. 18 months, and I didn't see it until it was nearly done. Next time, maintain direct relationships with regional members. Don't let the vice chair be the primary contact for any region. The chair's visibility in the membership has to be consistent, not just at the annual meeting. He filed the notebook. He went out to teach the 10 o'clock class. The UFAF had 41 member schools when Walsh left. It had 63 by the end of 1977. The American Martial Arts Alliance ran for 3 years before the structural problems Walsh had created. Significant regional autonomy without adequate national coordination produced the fragmentation that Chuck had predicted, and it dissolved in 1980. Several of the schools that had left with Walsh applied to rejoin the UFF in 1980 and 1981. Chuck accepted their applications through the normal process, without condition, without the kind of public accounting that a less disciplined person might have found satisfying. They had left. They had rejoined. The Federation's standards were what they were. If the schools met them, they were welcome. Ray Medina, who had been with the school since 1963 and the Federation since its founding, said once, in the late 1970s, that the Walsh situation was the best thing that had happened to the Federation's governance structure, because it showed us where the structure was weak, he said. It showed us where I was weak, Chuck said. That too, Ray agreed. They left it there. Epilogue the Army. By 1980, the United Fighting Arts Federation had over 100 member schools across 23 states. The standards had been refined 4 times. The governance structure had been modified twice more beyond the Walsh episode, each modification improving the balance between central standards and regional implementation that was the Federation's ongoing structural challenge. The instructor certification program, which had been a framework in 1974, had become a rigorous assessment process with documented requirements and external examiners. Chuck was 34 years old when he founded the Federation. He was 40 when it crossed 100 schools. He had not imagined, in the Van Nuys conference room above the sporting goods store, that the thing he was beginning would outlast the competitive career that had given him the credibility to begin it. But it did. The Federation continued operating and growing and revising its standards and training its instructors after Chuck's film career took over most of his public attention, after Walker Texas Ranger made his name into a different kind of known, after the cultural moment of the late 20th century converted him from a martial arts champion into something more complicated and more public. The schools kept teaching, the students kept learning, The belts kept meaning something because the standards that made them mean something had been fought for and protected and revised and protected again by a group of people who had understood in a conference room in Van Nuys in 1974 that the problem worth solving was not whether you could win a fight, but whether the next generation of practitioners would be taught by people who actually knew what they were doing. The army wore belts. The belts meant something. That was the whole point. That was what had always been worth fighting for.